Very good.
Hey, Ralph. Sorry I was a little late. We were trying to figure out things in the seminar room and I lost time.
I understand. You never quite know when you get some of these messages that you get don't speak the whole truth, do they? So
yes. It's luckily Gwen Chu reminded me, said, Tom, your time. We're trying to. Michael Nazar Ali is coming in. It's going to be hybrid next week, so we got to do a little of both. I'm going to get my thing up here. Just a second. Where is it?
I've got one slide that Sebastian asked me to prepare for him. So
okay. Just a second. I'm going to get my big camera set up here.
And I'm expecting him to join us soon.
I think that's a second, but I will soon have this right. Okay, here we go. Good. Okay, I'm going to make you. Let me put my video on. Okay, I'm going to make you co-host. See now. Oh, make host. Okay, you're now host.
Okie doke. I thought I would just. I'm just going to quickly write to Sebastian just to check that he's okay.
Yeah. Ralph, go ahead. So go ahead, Ralph.
Yes. So just a very brief chat about the upcoming 5 lectures. Tom asked me to organise a set of talks broadly around the theme of Orthodox Christianity and mission. And we have, it's quite eclectic, but we've got people from different corners of the world. We're starting very close to OCMS's home in terms of our speaker, but quite a long way away in terms of what he's talking about. And in the coming weeks, we'll have talks from Romania. Michael Nazar Ali is going to be talking to us as well, I think, about the Middle East. Father Michael Alexa will be talking to us about a mission in Alaska. And Alison Kolosova, who's just joined us, will be talking about mission in rural communities in Russia. And I'm boldly doing a talk on ancient languages and mission in Oriental churches, which I haven't written all the details of yet, but thinking about why about language, and particularly in relation to Ethiopia and some of its literary tradition and how that's part of mission. But today we're very privileged to have Sebastian Brock with us. I hope you've read his bio. Just a couple of things about Sebastian. I think it's fair to say, I remember once my doctoral supervisor corrected something I wrote about Sebastian. I described him as one of the world's leading scholars on Syriac Christianity, and Erica Hunter crossed it out and put the preeminent scholar on Syriac Christianity. Sebastian's research has been very far-reaching and has brought significant insight for those outside of the Syriac-speaking Christian world into that tradition, but also he's done great service to those within the tradition. I think you've supported quite a lot, Sebastian, haven't you, the St Ephrem Ecumenical Research Institute in India and various other places. In India, Sebastian goes by the name of the teacher of teachers. Is that not right, Sebastian? With a Syriac title. And amongst many other distinctions, 2 of the superb translations of the poetry of the 4th century Syriac writer St Ephrem have been set to music by Sir John Taverner. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, I think the album is called Thunder Entered Her, isn't it? And yes. There are 2 tracks on there. And perhaps, again, the distinction of some of the translation work that Sebastian has done is that not only is it scholarly, but it's also poetic. They've managed to bring those two together and produce material that's both intellectually insightful but spiritually very meaningful. So great pleasure to have you with us, Sebastian. And the first talk is mainly a historical perspective, which is Dr. Brock's speciality, and we're going to be in China and parts of the world related to China, and I think I'll leave it to Sebastian to explain the details of what you're going to talk about. I've got a couple of slides just to give you some orientation on where we're talking about, so I'll put that up just now for you, and hand over to you, Sebastian. Tell me when you want the other slide, and I'll just push the
Right.
button.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually going to be talking about the texts that the Syriac missionaries took to East Asia. And in fact, what I'll be speaking about, almost all of them come from this place, Turpan or Turfan. And the other places that are important will be Merv, just on the left of the map, and Xi'an, where the Chinese Syriac stele comes from. So I think perhaps if you give the other map now, I can.
Yes.
So Merv is to the east of the Caspian, bottom end of the Caspian there. Let me see what else. Yes, Turfan is there. And in fact, the texts that I'm talking about, almost all come from a monastery excavated at Bodleian, just north of Turfan. And then there's Xi'an, and so the coast is off to the right. So thank you very much, Ralph, for these maps. They're great help. But it's just Turfan is going to be the central place that my talk is concerned with, thanks to what has been found there. And all these things are due to the chances of what excavators and chance finds turn up. Now, if you read most standard histories of the Christian Church, you'll find there's a standard model of the Greek East being separated from the Latin West. And of course, the Latin West separates into Catholic and Reformed in the 16th century onwards. But this bifurcation, Greek versus Latin, seems to me very inadequate. And I like to say that there's actually a third element, which I call the Syriac Orient, consisting of the various Middle Eastern churches, many of which are non-Chalcedonian, so not recognized officially by the Catholic, Reformed, and Orthodox churches. They're the forgotten element, as it were, in the history of Christianity. And one component of the Syriac Orient is the Church of the East. And this church, as probably all of you know very well, was renowned for its missionary activity, and above all at a time when European missions were very modest in character. And the Church of the East, especially from the 7th century onwards up to the 13th century, was extremely active, spreading right across Asia along the Silk Route to China. And they'd already reached China by the 7th century, and this we know from this remarkable Chinese Syriac stele from Xi'an, set up in 781, but it tells about the arrival of the Christian missions in 635. Now, if you think of it, 635 is exactly the time of the Arab invasions in the Middle East. So the end of Byzantine or late Roman Empire and the advent of Islamic rule. So that's a remarkable coincidence, exactly at the same time this is happening in East Asia. Now, the aspect I'm going to concentrate on here is what texts did these missionaries bring with them? And the answer is entirely dependent on what has survived, which may not be entirely representative. One needs to keep that in mind all the time. The time scale in which I'm talking is really from the 8th, 9th century. This is the Tang dynasty in China, and up to the 12th, 13th century, which is the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China. Now, the source of knowledge of these texts is very largely thanks to the finds of many, literally thousands of fragments of manuscripts in different languages in the area of Torfan, and especially at Bulaik, where at the beginning of the 20th century, a monastery, or what turned out to be pretty certainly a monastery of the Church of the East, was excavated. And from these excavations, there are no less than 40,000 fragments. And these fragments are in 20 different languages and about the same number of different scripts. So a huge challenge to the academic world. And the 40,000 fragments are, in fact, only a small proportion of the fragments that were found in this region, because the others belong to Manichaeans, and most of our knowledge of the Manichaeans comes from these texts, and also a large number of Buddhist texts. Of the Christian texts, about just over 1,000 Christian texts from Torfan. And these are now mostly in Berlin. And very recently, there's been a lot of important work on them. And it's due to Erika Hunter and initiative she took that they are now catalogued, a very helpful catalogue, and some of the most important texts are, well, in the course of being published, both in Syriac and Sogdian and Uyghur. So moving on to the language of these Christian texts, the three main languages, Syriac, as you'd expect, which is Semitic, and then Sogdian, which is an Indo-European language related to Persian, and it belongs to the, as it were, the center of this map. You'll see Sogd. So it's actually quite a bit further west from Torfan. So the people who left manuscripts in Torfan, in Sogdian, were probably from a merchant community. The Sogs were great merchant. And then the third language is yet another family of languages. It's from the Turkic family of languages known as Uyghur, or indeed as Old Uyghur, because Uyghur is still spoken in Western China, and of course the Uyghur population is often in the news at the moment owing to the oppression of it by the Chinese authorities. Modern Uyghur is a sort of cousin, as it were, of Old Uyghur rather than daughter. And then, of course, the other language is Chinese. And this, of course, also has the most extensive amount of surviving texts, and texts that are complete, whereas most of the texts I'm talking about, almost all of them, in fact, are incomplete. They're just fragments. But I'm not going to cover these Chinese texts here, since none of them are translations. Now, there's one apparent exception to this, a text known as the Gloria in Excelsis, but if you read translations of it carefully, you'll see that it actually isn't a translation at all. And one of the main scholars working on these texts today has specifically pointed out that it's a mistake to call it a translation. So there's a very sharp contrast here between the Sogdian and Uyghur texts, which are translations from Syriac coming from Torfan, and the Chinese material, which are compositions made in China, and there are no exact translations. So it's only with the translated texts that I'm dealing with. So this explains why I'm saying nothing about what you may have been expecting about the Chinese texts. So first of all, before looking at the contents of the various texts, now proceed by language, it's important to take a look at the scripts. Now, as I said, the main languages we're concerned with are Syriac, Sogdian, Uyghur, but there are also separate scripts, Syriac scripts, Sogdian, Uyghur. So that sounds simple enough, but it's not straightforward because a language and script don't necessarily go together. And you can have a whole number of different combinations. And then I haven't included the very small number of examples in two other scripts. One is in Middle Persian or Pahlavi. There's just one fragmentary manuscript of the Psalms in that, and also about 5 words in Greek at the top of a manuscript, otherwise in Sogdian, with, again, the Psalms. As we'll see later, the Psalms are extremely well represented. Now, as I say, there are many possible combinations of languages and scripts. Now, you can have manuscripts in Syriac language, which have Syriac script, and this would be the majority of the Syriac fragments from Torfan. But there are some which are in quite a different script, the Uyghur script. And here one should remember that from the 9th century till the 14th century, Torfan was under Uyghur rule. So that really explains why you have that rather surprising combination. Turning to Sogdian, Sogdian has its own script, but in fact, the majority of texts in Sogdian language are written in Syriac script by quite a large majority. And then in the case of Uyghur language, we've got both in Uyghur script and in Syriac script. So this Turkic language written in Syriac script. Now you can also have 2 languages in the same manuscript. We have a certain number of bilingual manuscripts. The most interesting perhaps are the biblical ones, where you have Syriac and Sogdian. And we also have one manuscript in New Persian, but in Syriac script. And this is of the Psalms. And again, a manuscript in Uyghur language, but Syriac script, again of the Psalms. In the case of liturgical manuscripts, especially in the rather small number, or comparatively small number of fragments in Uyghur, we do have one very curious prayer book, probably a private prayer book, where we've got both Syriac prayers and Syriac in Uyghur script and also Uyghur. So combinations of two languages in the same manuscript. There's another possible way of combining languages, and that is where you have a main text in one language, but the rubrics in another. And this applies especially in liturgical texts, as you'd expect. So we've got texts in Syriac with Sogdian rubrics. These tend to be prayers, the baptismal texts like that. And then we also have Sogdian texts with Syriac rubrics. And this applies to the lectionaries, or some of the lectionaries. So one can envisage different contexts in which these combinations might be found. But I shan't delay on that, because I'd like to turn to the actual content of these texts. So I'll proceed language by language and start with Syriac. Now, one might expect a lot of biblical texts, but in fact, what we have are only biblical texts for liturgical use. There's one possible case where you might have a straight gospel text, but because these texts, fragments are so small, perhaps I could show on the, Ralph, if you could move the map for a moment, I'll just hold up to the screen the sort of thing one's dealing with. I don't know if you can see from that. Some are very much smaller. Yes, you see there. So if one's lucky, one's got a whole page. If one's unlucky, which is mostly the case, you've got much less than a whole page, and often not even a whole line. This causes a great deal of difficulties in identifying texts, of course. So one takes one's hat off to the various scholars who've done the identification of these texts. And I'll mention a couple of them in the course of what I say. So biblical texts are not straight biblical texts, except with one possible exception. They're all for liturgical use. That is to say, the Psalms will be provided with the canticles or odes, and these were clearly in common use, monastic use, of course, because we've got something like 15 different manuscripts and a couple of bilingual ones, which I've mentioned, the Syriac New Persian and Syriac Uyghur. So then for the New Testament, we've got several gospel lectionaries, some bilingual. One is just Sogdian with Syriac rubrics. And we also have a lectionary manuscript of the Pauline epistles. It's quite interesting that we should have these lectionaries because they're from the probably 10th, 11th century, which is actually quite early for a lectionary, specifically lectionary manuscript. Lectionaries only came into use about 8th, 9th century. That applies in Greek as well as Syriac. Before that, you'd simply indicate in a straight biblical manuscript where the liturgical lections were to be found. But obviously having a lectionary according to the liturgical year is much more convenient from the practical point of view. So the biblical texts are all for liturgical use. Turning to the other liturgical texts, we've got examples, small examples of most of the main texts. we have some fragments of the famous anaphora of Addai and Mari, which is the oldest surviving Eucharistic service in existence. It's very archaic. It doesn't even have a consecration narrative. It has an epiclesis, but not the words of institution narrative. Caused scholars a great deal of worry. So there are 3 Eucharistic anaphoras in use in the Church of the East, but we've only got Addai and Mari from Torfan. Later on, I'll mention some other, well, another manuscript which does have some of the other anaphoras. Now, one of the odd features of the Church of the East liturgical tradition is that they have a consecrated leaven, or a consecration of the leaven, which makes the Eucharistic loaves. And a bit of this leaven is reserved from previous celebration of the liturgy. And so you, in theory, you can take the leaven back all the way to the Last Supper. And there's a special rite for this leaven. These are increasing of the leaven, or the new leaven, joining with the old leaven. And we have a fragment of that service. It's a very nice idea where you have this concatenation linking you with the very origins of the liturgical tradition. I think it's confined to the Church of the East. And then we have a fragment of baptismal service. It's interesting to have this because it's by far the earliest, probably 9th century, this fragment, by far the earliest witness to the baptismal liturgy in the Church of the East to survive. All East Syriac liturgical manuscripts tend to be very late. We very rarely have anything from earlier than the 14th century. So this was interesting to find, and the content is actually very similar to the present day service, but the present day service has been expanded at various points. We've got fragments of burial service and of the ceremony of foot washing on Maundy Thursday. This is rather delightful because it's clear that incorporated in this ceremony, there's a certain amount of liturgical poetry, and liturgical poetry is often very inventive. And so in this fragmentary text, we have the 12 disciples compared to the 12 months of the year. We've actually got a similar text, but a different one from other sources. And then we also have fragments of a service for consecrating new liturgical vessels. This is a remarkable thing to have because it's very rare that that sort of text survives anywhere. Now, what I've mentioned so far, it's usually only one set of fragments representing a single manuscript. But when we turn to the festal hymnary, known as the Hudra, the cycle, it's quite a different picture because we've got over 21 different manuscripts. This is by far the most numerous liturgical text to survive. The Hudra is actually a very large book because it's covering the whole of the liturgical year, and it includes all the hymns, the liturgical hymns and prayers for each individual feast during this year. We have mostly just fragments, maybe a few folios, usually damaged, but we have one quite extensive manuscript. And this has been very recently published by Erica Hunter and Jip Coakley. Very interesting edition. So we can see from that the sort of liturgical text that this community was employing. So the Hudra manuscripts are by far the most common, far outweighing, well, by quite a long way, outweighing the Psalm manuscripts. Then a number of what one can call paraliturgical texts. And these are quite common in the Syriac tradition. They're sometimes called prayer amulets. They're prayers warding off demons of illness, demons of barrenness, and so on. And we've got 8 of these fragments from 8 different manuscripts. And one of them is bilingual in Syriac and Uyghur. And then also paraliturgical are a number of calendrical fragments. These are tables for discovering when Easter falls. So we've got these fixed cycle in the liturgical year, fixed dates in the calendar, and then the movable dates. And of course, Easter is the one great movable date. And so with the help of these calendars, the calendrical tables, you can work out when Easter is going to fall. Turning to more literary texts, these are not very well represented, but best perhaps represented are Lives of Saints, Hagiography. And one particularly interesting fragment is of a man called Bar Shabba, who was the apostle who went to, or missionary who went to Merv, to the east of the Caspian. So Merv is sort of the western end of the Silk Route. And it's through Merv that Christianity spread to Central Asia and then East Asia. So Bar Shabba is quite unsurprisingly commemorated, not only with this fragmentary life, and we have very little else in Syriac of his life. We do have one West Syriac text, which is quite different, but that's all. But the other place we find Bar Shabba mentioned is in this Hudra, which is quite extensive. So he's mentioned there as well. So he's clearly a very important figure for the community, Church of the East community in Torfan. The other saint who appears, the 2 different forms of his life, is St. George. St. George was immensely popular in the Middle East, and indeed he still is. I remember going to a shrine of St. George, both in Cairo and outside Aleppo, where there were lots of Muslim visitors as well as Christian ones. So it's not surprising that St. George should be represented here. And the lives of St. George vary enormously. There are many different, as it were, editions, recensions, and so on. Then there are a few miscellaneous texts. There's a fragmentary dialogue between a Jew and a Christian, which hasn't yet been published, though it's been announced, and that should be very interesting. It rather implies that there was a Jewish community present in Torfan in order to make it worthwhile copying such a text. Or perhaps even more surprising is a school philosophical text telling you how to distinguish between, and Syriac uses the Greek terms kataphasis and apophasis. something that's positive and something that's negative. And so this tells you various examples, hot and non-hot, and so on. It's very fragmentary, but there are such texts we know from elsewhere, but nothing exactly like this. So this must be in a sort of school text for maybe in monastic school, who knows. And then we've also got what seem to me medical recipes with telling you how to make certain antidotes for things, how to stop your hair falling out or going white is one of them. So that's an intriguing case. Of non-literary texts, there's a draft of a letter. This is quite puzzling because it seems to have been addressed to the emperor, and the only people who would address a letter to the emperor would be someone from a Melkite community, someone who's in communion with Constantinople. So it is known from other sources that the Melkite church, which was also at this time Syriac speaking, was very much present in Central Asia along with the Church of the East. There's all that I've been talking about so far of Syriac comes from Torafan, and this mostly from this monastery. There are a few other Syriac Christian texts from surrounding regions, but I'm not including them here. They're the same sort of thing that I've covered. But there is one quite extensive manuscript, which a Russian friend of mine, thanks to a friend of his in Taiwan, discovered in Taipei. And this is clearly a very late Syriac, that's say from the Yuan dynasty, 13th century Syriac manuscript in a very deformed Syriac script. And it consists of 3 completely different texts. One is an admonition delivered at the ceremony of betrothal, and at least in antiquity, in the Church of the East, betrothal was actually much more important than the marriage. And this is an admonition to the pair, bridal pair, given by the priest. Well, we don't have anything exactly like it from anywhere else, so this is particularly interesting. And then the other next quite extensive part of the text are a series of intercessions which seem to be related to intercessions in the 3 East Syriac anaphoras. We'll have to wait till this gets published to get the details, but there are very close links with all 3 anaphoras, Ada and Mari, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and Nestorius. So that in itself is extremely intriguing. And then the third element are very short texts, which are invocations of the saints. And they're written in Syriac, but it's an incredibly ungrammatical Syriac. The syntax simply doesn't work. So this is written by someone who is familiar with liturgical Syriac, but has no real idea of the grammar. So quite an interesting phenomenon that one should have such a collection of invocations. But they were all written down. There's several dozen of these, so it's not just some scribbling down of notes. Well, so much for Syriac. I turn now to Sogdian, and as I mentioned, this may be in Syriac script, that's the majority of manuscripts, or it may be in Sogdian script. And just a reminder that Sogdiana is quite a long way further west from Torafan, where the manuscripts were found. and thus indicating that one's really dealing with the trading community, though a trading community that must have provided quite a lot of the monastic community from the monastery at Bodleian. Starting with the biblical texts, again, they're all for liturgical use. We don't have any clear examples of straight biblical texts. From the Old Testament, we've got, again, it's the Psalms, which survive, a very small fragment. And this is one of the fragments has the beginning of Psalm 33 or 32 in the Septuagint. And it has the Greek, in Greek script, the opening words of the psalm. And again, this points to the fragment having originated with the Melkite community and not the Church of the East, who would not have been using the Septuagint, have no link with the Septuagint. So this was a great surprise when that turned up. In the case of New Testament texts, they're virtually all lectionaries. We've got gospel lectionaries, fragments. There's one quite extensive one which has rubrics in Syriac. This probably dates from about the 11th century. And then there are bilingual Syriac and Sogdian gospel lectionaries, which work verse by verse. So quite an interesting phenomenon, which is really the same sort of thing that you have in the Targum, where the Targum is the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And if you look at a Targum manuscript, you'll have the first few words or even letters of the Hebrew verse and then the Targum. So the Hebrew is read out, Targum verse, Aramaic translation, and then you proceed verse by verse. So the same sort of thing seems to have happened with these bilingual Syriac Sogdian gospel manuscripts. We also have, again, bilingual, a lectionary for the Pauline epistles. We don't have many other liturgical texts, apart from what seems to be liturgical office for the martyrs. In the Syriac tradition, the great honor is paid to the Persian martyrs who suffered under Shapur II. That's in the middle of the 4th century, at the time when the Christian Roman Empire persecution had ceased. And these Persian martyrs are still very prominent in the East Syriac liturgical tradition. This office is in fact bilingual again. And then a very interesting text is fragments of a commentary on the liturgy, on the both baptism and Eucharistic liturgy. And this happens to be a text we know from other sources as well. And this is the first time it's turned up in the context of the Church of the East, but it first became known in a Melkite manuscript, and then some Syrian Orthodox examples came to light, and it's very primitive in it's as a commentary on the liturgy. We've got a huge number of later commentaries on the liturgy, and you can sort of trace their development one to another. And this is the oldest form that we have, and it was very influential, being found in all 3 Syriac liturgical ecclesiastical traditions. And it was especially influential in both the Church of the East and in the Syrian Orthodox tradition, but also known in the Melkite tradition. So that was a very intriguing text to turn up. Now, in the case of translations of literary texts from Syriac, we've got far larger number than we have with those in Syriac language. Perhaps this isn't too surprising. We've got a lot of hagiography. The Persian martyrs are extremely well represented, martyrs under Shapur II, and also a later martyr, Pethian, who was under Yezdegerd II. And we have St George again, and then St Sergius and Bacchus, who were extremely popular saints in all the Syriac churches, and indeed in the Greek church too, military saints. We have monastic saints, and the legendary or supposed traditional founder of monasticism in the Church of the East is a man called Augen or Eugenios, and he was supposed to have lived in the 4th century. We in fact don't have any mention of him in any text until the 7th century, and it seems that legends grew up around this name very rapidly from the 7th century onwards. And he ends up with 70 disciples, each of whom, or many of whom, get their own lives written. And Augen is known in both the East and the West Syriac tradition, and is an extremely important figure in Syriac monastic history. A more historical figure is John of Dailam, who a fragment of his life has turned up in Sogdian. He was a very interesting monk from the 7th century, who was working a little south of the Caspian, and he ended up founding a bilingual monastery, Syriac and Persian. Very interesting phenomenon, and the life tells how there was arguments in the community, which language should they use in the liturgy. This was obviously going to be a great problem in many different monastic communities, which were international in character. And in this case, it ended up with Syriac monks living on one side of the river and the Persian-speaking monks living on the other. Now, not everywhere had a convenient river where you could solve the matter so conveniently. 2 other hagiographical texts worth mentioning. Very famous and influential cycle to do with the 7 sleepers or 8 sleepers of Ephesus, a text which is also known to the Quran, and another very widespread and popular text, the Finding of the Cross, the Invention of the Cross by Queen Helena. So a good range of hagiographical texts. And I should have mentioned also one of the Egyptian saints, monastic saint St Serapion, who seems to be very important in East Syriac monastic literature. So we've got 2 manuscripts with bits of his life. In some ways linked with hagiography are the apocryphal texts. There's one text concerning Simon Peter and Simon Magus, the imagined argument. Of course, you've got to trace the origins of that is in the Book of Acts. And then another very popular text in Eastern Christianity, the Dormition of Mary, of the Virgin Mary. And a 3rd text which deals with the fates of the apostles, where they all ended up. And this was very important for later communities which wanted to trace their apostolic origins. So what these texts, and we've got quite a lot of them surviving in much fuller form, these texts, as it were, link up places with apostles. So, and this applies not only to the apostles, but to the 70 disciples who get sent out. So each of those is sent to a different place, and that provides the link with the apostolic age. So far, all these texts are texts which were composed in Syriac but translated into Sogdian. We've also got quite a number of texts which were written in Greek originally, but translated into Syriac and then into Sogdian. Amongst these are some apostolic canons, but the majority are of monastic character. And in all Eastern monastic tradition, the great intellect of the monastic world is Evagrius of Pontus. He was immensely influential, even in the Greek world where he was eventually condemned, but he survives under someone else's name, Nilus and others. But we have, in fact, lost a great deal of his writings in Greek, but they do survive in Syriac and Armenian, two ecclesiastical communities where he was not condemned. So a large number of Evagrius' texts only survive in translation. And one of these translations, which then got into Sogdian, is of the Antireticos, how you answer bad passions. If you suffer from anger, it tells you which biblical passage to use to counterbalance that anger. A very useful set of texts, especially for monks, of course. Another very popular monastic writer in Greek was a man called Abba Isaiah, who is connected either with Skete in Egypt or with Gaza. He's quite a problematic figure for historians know where he came from, but we do have a work called the Asceticon by him, surviving best in Syriac, but quite a lot in Greek, and bits of this could get into Sogdian. We also have another popular Greek writer, Macarius. This is Macarius, one of the Macariuses of Alexandria, attributed to, but usually by modern scholarship, it's thought to be of Mesopotamian origin. But very recently, a monk of the monastery of St Macarius in Egypt has written a very learned book, not yet published, claiming that the Macarian homilies actually are from Egypt and probably from Egyptian Macarius. So we'll wait and see what happens to that discussion in the academic world. But anyhow, there's one text by Macarius which actually gets into Sogdian. And then, not surprising, we've got sayings from the Egyptian fathers. We've got fragments of that. But turning back to texts which were written in Syriac, and this is perhaps the most interesting finding of what's turned up in Sogdian, and many of these identifications have only been made very recently by Nicholas Sims Williams, who is the world expert on Sogdian language and literature, and has published most of these texts, or in fact, virtually all these texts, and a couple of scholars, Gregory Kessel from Russia and Adrian Perter from Romania, who've made some very interesting identifications. Well, who are these monastic writers? They're all from the 7th century, which is interesting in itself because we've got a lot of later monastic literature in Syriac from the 8th century, famous writers, but none of that has turned up yet. The three who have turned up from the 7th century, a man called Dardisho, and incidentally, all these three writers are connected with the same monastery of Rabban Shabur, which is in Western Iran. Its locality is not precisely known, but it's certainly in modern Western Iran. So first of these, Dardisho, and we've got fragments of two commentaries of his. One is on the Asceticon of Abba Isaiah, and the other is on his collection of the, on a contemporary collection of sayings of the Desert Fathers, known as the Book of Paradise. So fascinating, these two commentaries of monastic interest should get into Sogdian. And then a second writer connected with the monastery of Rabban Shabor in Iran is Shemun Taibuthe, Shemun of the Book of Grace. And these are got into Sogdian, a collection of sayings. But perhaps most interesting of all, and this is the most recent set of identifications by both Nicholas Sims-Williams and Adrian Perter, are texts from Isaac of Nineveh, who is by far the most famous of the East Syriac monastic writers of this period. His part one of his writings, the first collection, were translated into Greek in the 9th century, early 9th century, and then into many different languages, into Slavonic in the Middle Ages, into Latin, and he's got all over the world, and it also got eaten into Arabic in the Eastern world, and more recently into Persian. So bits of this first collection, which is the one which is most widespread, but in the late 20th century, a second collection turned up, actually in the Bodleian in Oxford. And this second collection was much less well known. It got into, or parts of it got into Arabic. We now know that parts of it were read in the Melkite Church. We've got a number of manuscripts with parts of it, but it was chiefly known in the Church of the East and in part in the Syrian Orthodox Church. A lot of East Syriac manuscripts got into the Syrian Orthodox tradition at some early date, despite the fact that their Christological positions are quite the opposite. But monastic literature is non-polemic and so much more acceptable. Now, we've got a number of fragments from this second collection actually translated into Sogdian. So this is a very exciting recent discovery. One further text, which again, this is Nicholas Sims-Williams discovered, identified, is another very famous text, but non-Christian, the sayings of Ahikar, or story of Ahikar, the Assyrian sage. Extremely widespread text going back to the Assyrian Empire in 7th century BC, and known in many different languages, including Syriac, and now we've got a Sogdian fragment of it. But I see time's running on, so let me deal with Uyghur rather speedily, because we haven't actually got very much in Uyghur. We've got about 50 fragments. They're often extremely difficult to decipher, and there's a German scholar, Peter Ziemer, who has done fantastic work on this. And we've got a few biblical fragments, which again are psalm fragments. And I think a few gospel fragments. And these anticipate a 14th century translation of the whole New Testament and the Psalms by a Western scholar called Giovanni di Montecorvino in the 14th century. He was became the Archbishop of Khan Balik, that's modern Beijing. So that's the beginning of the 14th century, and then it's not until the late 19th century that we actually get the modern Uyghur translations done by, in fact, someone with an Armenian name working for the Swedish mission. And we've got a few non-biblical texts. We've got a bit of a creed, a fragment on the Magi. The Magi are very popular in Syriac tradition, and indeed there are not just 3 Magi usually, but 12 Magi in East Syriac liturgical texts. We don't know how many Magi there are in this fragment. It's too small. We've also got some prayers as a Syriac.
Looks like we lost his link. Ralph, do you want to try to contact him and have him rejoin?
I'll do my best.
Yeah, because he was pretty strong through there, so we could take a moment until he reconnects. You write him, I'm reclaiming host, just in case he joins, and then I'll make sure to let him enter, yeah.
Sent him an email, but I don't have a phone number, I'm afraid. So
Okay, well, let's just wait a second. I'm sure he'll notice that.
Yes, eventually.
Something that is amiss, and then we'll attempt to rejoin.
Let's see him.
How familiar are you with the text that he was discussing? Is that the first time you've heard of them, or?
A good number of them have made their way to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Quite a few of the so-called Nestorian texts found their way to a non-Chalcedonian Orthodox church. Again, usually under pseudonyms. Theodore Mopsuestia is one of the most quoted writers in Ethiopia, but not under his name.
My question in that regard is, were they all located in the same place, or did they uncover several monasteries in the area with different texts? Because since you got Sogdian, you got Persian, you've got Malachite, you've got just all kinds of different texts. Was there someone who's collecting these in a single place, or is this a variety of digs or areas?
The larger part came from one extensive dig that was done by some German archaeologists in Turfan, and I think he said initially it's believed that was the site of a monastery. There's evidence to show that, although again it's quite it's not absolutely clear. And then some of those others from Balaik and places is that there are other sites, but the vast majority are from this Turfan location in Western China. I'm sorry we've lost Sebastian.
Yeah, I was hoping he would rejoin. I don't see him attempting to join. Well, we'll pick your brain, Ralph, for a little bit and see if he rejoins. Okay, one of the things he's talking about is this group of traders. Are they the ones who are funding and supporting the monks coming in as sort of a group alongside to sort of provide some kind of sense of spirituality and faith for these communities? And are they, how long are they in place? Or are they nomadic communities that are moving back on the Silk Road?
Again, a question I have a part of an answer to, if so to mean. So it does seem, at least to a certain extent, that this Turfan place is the sort of the end of a long road.
Yeah.
And Murder, as you saw, is quite a lot further over to the west. So it seems that, I mean, a lot of Christianity spreads to these regions with traders. So the great churches are found along known trade routes. And it seems, from what I understand, that there was quite a long-lasting relationship between Merv and Turfan, which was supported by traders who brought material for the monastery. How the details of that connection, I certainly don't know in any detail.
Yeah.
Whether Sebastian does or not. Again, a lot of this material really has only been understood in the last few years and decades. Right. So we haven't joined up all the dots yet. But it seems, as you say, it's quite surprising and a surprising find that there were Melkite churches in this region. Perhaps we had assumed that wasn't the case. Any sign?
No sign. David, do you have a question?
I had a question. Yes, Sebastian mentioned in passing what he called the Xi'an monument. And I have to say, I mean, this was an excellent bibliographical history. But I'm just wondering if you know the reason why this was originally dismissed by some people as a Jesuit forgery. I know, in a sense, this is this issue has been addressed with the discovery of the documents that Sebastian referred to.
Yes.
But are there still some scholars who think that this particular monument was a forgery? No, you don't have to answer it. I'm just
It's a good question, which I can put to Sebastian via and answer via email. Again,
sorry about it.
Sure.
I mean,
it was quite fashionable, I think, to believe that some of these Eastern peoples weren't in a position to do such things, if you like. So it was a sort of the automatic assumption, wasn't it? And then, of course, that scholarship has to be challenged. And I think, again, the legacy of this find and some others shows that there was much more basis, I think, for assuming that such a monument was actually produced by Christians. And again, the labeling of them as Nestorian. Sebastian has a very good article where he describes the term Nestorian as a lamentable misnomer for these Christians. So the Council of Ephesus was what broke the relationship, I think it's fair to say. But to dismiss all of these Christians some centuries on as, if you like, buying into the Western understanding of what the Nestorian heresy was is not fair at all.
Right.
But again, when particularly Jesuit missionaries come, that assumption underlies how they regard them. Perhaps most, I mean, how the Indian Christians were treated in the Synod of Jampa is the most notorious example of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was quite late, 1599. Oh, he's lost the link. I'm going to just forward him the link again.
Forward him the link, and then we can give another question for you, Ralph.
Yeah.
Ethnically, who are the monks? Are they Quakers? Are they Syrians? Are they Persians? Are they or are they a mix of things along this road? And there he is. So we can turn to the source. So I will.
We've got you back, have we?
He will be joining Sebastian. go ahead and turn on your mic and your video, Sebastian, as soon as you can.
We've got you back, Sebastian. So sorry.
When did you lose me? I'm so
We
sorry.
lost you right when you were turning to the Uyghurs.
Yes.
And so go ahead and finish up on the Uyghur documentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
There's some very difficult questions which I've been trying to field.
Well, I was very short on, I hadn't very much to say on the Uyghurs, since the number of fragments is very small and they're very difficult to deal with. There's a wonderful German scholar, Peter Zimmer, who is a real expert at reading Old Uyghur in Syriac script, which is not the easiest thing to do. And you've also got to read Syriac in Uyghur script, which is even more difficult sometimes. So there are a few biblical fragments, including Psalms, which anticipates the fragments, anticipates much later translations into Uyghur. One in the 14th century by an Italian scholar, early 14th century, who ended up as Archbishop of Khanbalik, that's Beijing. And then it wasn't until the 19th century that you get people working in translations into Uyghur. In fact, a man who's clearly an Armenian from his name, working for the Swedish mission. And then a few very fragmentary non-biblical texts, a bit of a creed, fragment on the Magi, a wedding blessing, and a few prayers, including a bilingual Syriac and Uyghur prayer book, but all in Uyghur script. Incidentally, in the Magi, although we don't know how many Magi there were on the fragments, too small, in the Church of the East there are 12 Magi and not 3. And that one would expect would also be the case at Torfan. So then I moved quickly on to some very brief conclusions. First of all, making the very sharp contrast, reminding of the sharp contrast situation between Sogdian and Uyghur on the one hand and Chinese on the other, the former being a translation literature, the latter indigenous creations, so the representation of the Christian message in an indigenous form. Mm-hmm. So two very different attitudes to how missionary activity should proceed. Though, of course, in the case of this Sogdian Uyghur, remember that one's dealing with perhaps very different contexts, and since it's a monastery, you're not facing the same questions. And then secondly, stress the public liturgical reading of the Bible is into the native languages, into Sogdian and Uyghur, as far as one can make out. But the liturgical rites themselves, the Eucharist, the baptism, burial, and so on, remain in Syriac, though the rubrics are in another language, in these cases in Sogdian. And then the third point is the remarkable emphasis on the survival of monastic texts translated from Syriac into Sogdian, especially of 7th century native Syriac writers. And this is no doubt partly explained by the fact that it comes from a monastery, but it's fascinating to know that these 7th century Syriac writers should be so well represented right across miles away from their homeland. So that, I think, is where I got. I'm so sorry about the break.
No, it was fine. Ralph did a very good job in your absence.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
But we did have a good question from David Singh. And David, I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead and ask now Sebastian the question that you wanted to ask him.
Well, Ralph has already partially answered this question. I was just thanking you for this excellent history of the Nestorian text. But I had a question about this Xi'an monument that you referred to in passing.
Yes.
I'm told that this monument was originally dismissed by some as the Jesuit forgery. And I'm just thinking that in light of the discovery of the luminous religious documents, this problem is in a sense taken care of. But are there still some scholars who think that this is a forgery?
No, it's now settled that the Xi'an stele is genuine, and it was simply the religious polemics of the time that led people. And also the totally surprising thing that you should get a text in both Syriac and Chinese. And I mean, it took the, as it were, the academic world of the time by total surprise. So one can see why polemic might have got into the argument. But I think by the time, or a century after that, people became convinced that it's absolutely genuine, and no more bilingual texts have been found, but more texts inscribed on steles have been found just in Chinese language. And I think there's absolutely no problem. There's actually a very interesting book on the history of people's reactions to the stele by someone whose name I've stupidly gone and forgotten, but it is a documented history of the gradual realization that this is actually quite genuine. Mm-hmm. It's rather like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
At first, they were so surprising to biblical scholars that a number of people thought that they were medieval documents or even forgeries. So now that's entirely settled, and it's the same with the Xi'an stele.
Thank you.
Sebastian, I have a question for you. In terms of these monastic communities, were the monks largely sent from other countries, other ethno groups, and coming out and then working on translations, or were these Uyghurs themselves who were beginning to read and translate these texts? And what was going on here in terms of even the interaction of what we could know about who made up these monastic communities and supported them and carried them through this region of the Silk Road?
And there's a whole lot of wonderful questions, and I skipped over them because they're unanswerable.
Okay.
But what we do know is that the higher clergy, the bishops, were from the, as it were, the central area. They were all Syriac speaking, and we don't actually know anything about the bishops in this area at this time, but from what we know about the movements of bishops and especially the letter of Patriarch Timothy in the early 9th century, his appointing bishops to places in Central and East Asia. So the bishops go out from the center, as it were, and what happens below that is really unknown. And we have to guess from the evidence of the actual texts themselves. And one can see in the materials that I've been talking about several different possible scenarios. You've got Syriac texts with Sogdian rubrics, so that's clearly pointing to a community that is primarily Sogdian reading or probably speaking to, but they're using these old liturgical texts as rather like Latin with, say, English or French rubrics. And that is probably the most common of the situations, but the case of the texts in scripts that don't belong to the language, that's an intriguing one, and one can envisage various different contexts where that might be might have brought that about, but it's all guesswork.
Yeah.
And I wish we had some evidence. I'm from, we've got a number of Uyghur texts in form of tombstones written in Syriac script, and they often have a initial phrase or two in Syriac, sort of formulaic phrase that he left this world of woes, etc. And then it all goes, still continuing in Syriac script, but in Uyghur language. So that's the same sort of thing as with these liturgical texts. People are familiar with the liturgy. They have a very poor knowledge of the Syriac language, but the script, as it were, lasts longer than language.
Yeah.
And I think that's what has happened in these cases.
Yeah, let me encourage anyone to ask a question. I see Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah.
Andrew Person, go ahead and ask the question. I see your hand up there, Andrew.
I think he has to.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry. It's a while since I've done one of these and I forgot all the little tricks. Thank you, Sebastian, for very comprehensive treatment there. I'm coming from a particular interest in the translations from Syriac of biblical materials into Arabic.
Yes.
And a couple of questions there that struck me, not particularly on Arabic, but on what you're saying. Firstly, the biblical translations that you've got from Turfan, are they done strictly from the Peshitta, or are there any variations or any possibilities of a work from a different form of the Syriac scriptures? And secondly, what is the translation style of the translations from Syriac that you have? I noticed that the biblical translations from Syriac into Arabic exhibit what some people regard as a sort of free style of translation, or much freer style than translations into Arabic from the Greek, in that you quite often get bits of commentary, explanation, expansion of a phrase or sentence in the Arabic from the Syriac, which does not occur when it's a translation from the Greek into Arabic. I wondered if you had similar phenomena in the languages you've been dealing with there.
Yes, your first question, the translation is always from the Peshitta, the Syriac translation. The only possible exception is this fragment of the Psalms with the Greek heading. And I've not studied this myself, but I've seen it said that there's some influence from the Septuagint. Well, that's not to be not surprising, but it's also said that you can see traces of Syriac too. But as I haven't studied this, so I can't really answer that. But in the case of the Sogdian translations, these are all from Syriac, of the Gospels and the lectionaries and so on. And it seems to be a rather literal translation as far as I can gather. I don't know Sogdian, so I can't judge this myself. I'm actually very interested in the history of biblical translations in Syriac, and what tends to happen is the earlier ones are fairly free, and then you get more and more close to the text. So, say 4th century, the old Syriac Gospels are often somewhat paraphrastic, whereas in the 7th century revisions, you can actually reconstruct the underlying Greek text with a high degree of accuracy, which is not something you can usually do with translations. So it would be interesting to know if there was a development in Sogdian translation technique, but at the moment, with the rather scanty evidence, one doesn't know. I mean, it could be that the fact that they do seem to be very literal, that could mean that the technique is taken over from the contemporary Syriac technique from Greek, sort of hangover. But who knows?
Thank you very much.
Interesting questions.
Go ahead, Alison. Unmute.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Sebastian, for the most fascinating lecture. I'm particularly interested in the presence of Christians among the Turkic peoples to the kind of east and north of the Caspian Sea.
Yes.
And have particularly recently been reading about Arabic travelers to, for example, Khazaria or the Khazar Empire, and finding Christians there and describing the presence of Christians there. And I'm wondering, knowing that the trade routes from there were going east, do you know anything about, or what is known about these Christians, and what language were they using, and who were they? I mean, were they the product of these missions in the East?
Almost certainly, yes. And in some cases, in sort of region of Khazaria, I think you may have Melkite missions as well as Syriac ones. The people involved, we know texts, we have texts in Syriac where certain monks travel as missionaries, and that seems to have been perhaps the normal pattern. And then around those, you'd have small communities built up of indigenous peoples. But unfortunately, we have very little information in the way of narrative texts for this. There's snippets that you'll find in medieval chronicles, both Syriac and especially in Arabic texts. But it's in travelogues that, in fact, you can get the most information, really. And I gather this is not a field I know really anything about. There are comparatively large number of Arabic travelogues of one kind or another. We have one wonderful Syriac travelogue from the end of the period I've been dealing with, from the late 13th, early 14th century. And this is the visit, it's really Marco Polo in reverse, visit of two monks who are probably Uyghur speakers from what is modern Beijing area, from that area, who go as ambassadors of the Mongol authorities, the Yuan authorities, to the West. And they come to they get to the Middle East. They get to Europe. They land at Naples, I think it is, and witness a naval battle from the hillside. And then they go to Rome. They go to Paris. They meet, I think, the King of England in France. And this was probably written in Persian, but it survives in Syriac translation. And there's a wonderful English annotated translation by an Italian colleague of mine, Pier Giorgio Bobone, well worth reading. It's a marvelous book he's done, and the older English translations, but Pier Giorgio.
And what would be the title of that book?
I think it's called The History of Mar Yabalaha. Yabalaha is the name of one of the monks who became the Catholicos of the Church of the East, because he was in high standing with the Mongol authorities. The other bishops thought he'd make a good patriarch. In fact, his knowledge of Syriac wasn't all that good. This is commented on. This is a really fascinating narrative all the way across Central Asia and his time, especially in Constantinople, where he spends most of his time visiting relics. That's a very interesting account of the relics. And then, as I say, through Italy to France. He's interrogated in Rome to see if he's heretical, and of course they think of him as coming from the East and so from the Greek world, so they ask him about whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father or the Father and the Son. So they ask all the wrong questions, and so he's allowed to celebrate, and I think the local cardinals take communion and vice versa, so they're in communion. Very interesting ecumenical situation.
Thank you.
PDF version, I've just put the link in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Archive.org. Is this the history of Yabala III, Nestorian Patriarch, and of his vicar Bar Salma, yes?
Yes, that's right. Borbone is the author.
It says James A. Montgomery.
Oh, yeah, that's an old one.
Okay.
That's quite a good translation. It's not the whole text, but
Right.
Borbone, B-O-R-B-O-N-E, is
Okay.
the one that's really worthwhile reading, because
Okay.
it's got an excellent commentary, very lengthy commentary.
Mark Oxbrock, go ahead, Mark.
Just a quick one. Sebastian, thank you very much for your great exposition today. We suffer in contemporary world church of almost unidirectional travel of theology from the West to other parts of the Christian world. You mentioned the translation and perhaps adoption of Greek and Latin texts in the Syriac world. Was that unidirectional, or was there adoption and reception of Syriac texts at that period in time in the Greek and Latin world?
Yes, that's an interesting question. It seems that in the round about 400 AD, Syriac poetry had enormous prestige. Ephrem, the great poet of the 4th century, was known by name. He's mentioned during his lifetime by Epiphanius, and at least the model of his hymns was taken over, and people like Ambrose were starting writing hymns which not directly influenced by him, but the idea probably. And it's clearly that liturgical poetry was in some cases translated. We don't have any clear examples of Ephrem's poetry in Greek. What we do have is a huge amount of Ephrem in Greek, or attributed to Ephrem in Greek, but it's from ascetic texts, and only very little of it is identifiable as Ephrem, and most of it is actually written in Greek, almost certainly, and of monastic origin, very much later. So there are one or two texts that do get and are very influential, and they're both 7th century texts. A very surprising difference. One is the Apocalypse of Methodius, known as Pseudo-Methodius, which is about the end of time, as the title suggests. That gets into Greek very early on, several recensions in Greek, gets into Latin in the early 8th century, and is enormously influential on imperial ideology. So that's one rather surprising case. And the other is Isaac of Nineveh, whose first part of whose works, large number of homilies, over 60 homilies, get translated into Greek at the monastery of Mar Saba in Palestine. And what is surprising is that his name gets taken over. Usually what happens when texts from a church regarded as heretical, as the so-called Nestorian church would have been, the names get changed, but his name survives, and he's also called Bishop of Nineveh. So it's a remarkable acceptance. But what is intriguing is that two other texts slipped in with him, because they were evidently in the Greek Syriac manuscript that was translated into Greek. And one of them is the West Syriac author Philoxenus, 6th century, and it's a monastic epistle of his, strongly influenced by Evagrius. And the other, several, I think the 4 different texts by John of Dalyatha, who's a 8th century monastic author of the Church of the East, very beautiful, very influential later on, and whose texts are only in modern times being recovered and being quite influential. John of Dalyatha is an amazingly intimate in his approach. He has some amazing prayers, often quite short, but really quite astonishing prayers of a nature that you don't often come across. So those two, they're both very influential, because Isaac got translated into many different languages, and the Pseudo-Methodius Apocalypse as influential in a different way. So they make up the rather lack of other texts.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, let's go to the seminar room. Does someone have a question there? Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for your lecture, Professor Brock. My first question is that what do all these texts, languages, scripts, and translation tell us about the vitality of the Christians in that large area? So that's my first question. Second question is that it's about the Chinese emperor in the Tang dynasty. To what extent does this vitality reach the royal courts or even reach the emperor at that time? And thirdly, my third question is, I was told that the Christianity was banned quite soon afterwards, quite suddenly. And what was the reason for that?
Yes, I'll answer the third question first, because it's much easiest. It was banned with the change of dynasty, and Chinese dynasties were either xenophobic or non-xenophobic. And in this case, the change was from one that was open to outside influences to a dynasty, I forget the name of the next dynasty, but it was specifically xenophobic in character. And so you have to wait till the Yuan dynasty until you get another dynasty that's open to influences. And because being a Mongol dynasty, they had their empire right across the rest of Asia. Your second question, I'm too ignorant to know, because I specialize in actually early Syriac literature, and I don't know Chinese, and there's a lot of recent literature by both Chinese and Western scholars on the Chinese literature from this period, and some of that's beginning to become more available to the general reader. There's an Italian scholar who is in fact a monk in Italy, who's fairly soon going to produce a very good collection of translations of the Chinese texts from this period, and he will have an excellent introduction. His name is, I think it's Nicoli Zani. So it's a double-barreled name, ends up Zani, so it'd be quite easy to recognize. I don't think it's published yet, but it's available in Italian, but there's an English translation, which I've seen a draft of, so it should be fairly soon out. But there are other scholars too who work a lot on this, and in Salzburg in Austria, been a series of conferences on the topic of Christianity in China in the Tang period, where both Chinese and Western scholars have got together, and they've produced a number of volumes of proceedings of their conference papers. So there's a lot going on, and there are new finds, some of which have been misleadingly interpreted, but others are certainly, as it were, genuine texts or genuinely Christian. It's sometimes a bit difficult to tell, I gather, whether a text is Christian or Manichaean or Buddhist, because a lot of the technical terminology, the words for God and so on, are the same. And it's known that the Christian missionaries adopted the terminology that was used by the two dominant religions of the time, which were Buddhism and Manichaeism. So if you've got a text that is non-explicit about some Christian form of point of doctrine, which would identify it at once, you have to remain in doubt whether it is actually Christian or not.
Good.